Good morning. We're going to be at 10 minutes before we actually probably get started. The peace pole dedication or remembrance session is still going on. As soon as all those people are up here, then we'll begin. So those who were tuned in remotely, let you know that we are gathered, but there are more people coming. So we'll be back with you in just a couple minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. We have so many friends here that people are still visiting and welcoming, and we're thankful to have you all here. I'm Penny Branscombe-Leggett, and I am the president of the new class, and I'm also representing the First United Methodist Church of Orlando, welcoming those of you who are here in person and those of you who are online. We're very thankful to have you all. We're in for a wonderful day. I wanted to tell you this is our 50th year of being a Sunday school class. And it's also, it's also our 50th year of having a theology weekend. I have the list. This book is the 1971 to 1991 book, and it lists the members then, and it lists all the theology people we had already. So it's a rich Methodist new class tradition, and I want to welcome you all. And now I'm turning it over to John Richard to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. Just a little background. As Penny mentioned, this is a 50-year tradition for the new class. Interestingly enough, it's Dominic Crossan's 30th anniversary of starting with us. 30 years ago this year, we started a course here called The Historic Jesus, based upon Dom's book, The Historical Jesus. And that week of the first presentation, Dominic actually came to speak with us, which is exactly 30 years ago. This is his third theology weekend for us, so about every 10 years, we have to have him back for a refresher. And as Dominic and I have said, we've kind of grown old together. We also want to welcome Sarah, his wife, who's here. Sarah has always been so helpful in getting things together, making things happen. And so Sarah's here with her sister, Nancy Sexton, so we welcome them as special guests today. Also, many of you do not know that Bob Brantley, a former member of the class, has a Sunday school class that he's a member of in Tennessee. They're joining us for this discussion, as well as Joyce Johnson from Northern Georgia. Joyce and her Sunday school class is joining us, as well as the new class people and their friends locally. So we probably have over 100 in attendance today one way or another. So those of us who are here distancing, all vaccinated and all masked, we're glad to be here, but we also want to make sure that those who are not here are welcome. Theology Weekend was really organized to begin with to understand deep theological questions. In those first years, 20 years or so, the class concentrated on the great German scholars. And that was the basis. And we didn't know that then, but we were in preparation, understanding the beginning of the research and so forth into understanding the historic Jesus. But that's what those guys were all doing in Germany, doing the groundwork, which allowed the research and understanding of what we have learned about Jesus as a person, as well as Jesus as a person of faith. So it's a logical progression through 50 years. Dominic's big books and career were spent in understanding the historic Jesus. And that's what we are going today to the important part of this thing. And Dominic, we talked earlier, we are in this discussion of this book, which how to read the Bible and still be a Christian. The fundamental question here is so much of the Bible is in a superficial way or a deep way, if you look at it, anti-Christian. And how is that possible? And that's what we're going to be discussing today, is that, as Dominic and I talked, there are two trains running through the entire Bible. One is the train of violence, and we've got plenty of that, and you can tune in most fundamental TV stations and so forth. You have many who call themselves Christians who worship a God of violence. And what Dominic has given us is the tools to worship. Give us a God who is worthy of worship versus a God who is worthy of fear. And I want you to think about that. Who do we worship? Where do we find divinity? And one of those, his metaphor, one of these trains running through the Bible is the train of violence, fueled by lots and lots of verses in the Bible. The other train is the fear of justice, and compassion, and nonviolence. And the real question we deal with in this book is, which train are we on, and which train is Jesus on? And why? Why, looking at the Christian Bible, Genesis through Revelation, do we have both of these options? Both totally biblical. But at some point we need to decide which of these two options, which of these two trains does Jesus ride himself, and therefore we as a follower of this Jesus, this Prince of Peace, versus a God of violence. Which train are we on? And if we're on the train with Jesus, then why? And we have to read our Bible to understand why we have those options and why it's really important for us to understand how to share our faith as worshiping a nonviolent God, as exemplified by the life of the historic Jesus. So with kind of that introduction, with Dom's blessing, that sets the stage. We will have a mic. I will have a mic here during, if you have questions. I will be able to come around to you. Just raise your hand. And Dominic will be at another mic, and we will have a discussion as much as possible. But we want to have his format is normally this. Dominic will make basically a presentation. Then we'll have a long Q&A session. Around 11:30, we'll break for lunch. We'll have about 45 minutes for lunch, and we'll come back around 12:15 and stay until 2:15 or 2:30. And we will promise you we'll be out of here by 2:30, and that's the deal. We appreciate the fact that Vance is here this morning, and I think I saw Cameron come in. So we have our theological firepower here. And Jason Locke is here. Jason, hi, Jason, our new director of the Chancel Choir. Jason, welcome. Are there other people that we need, before we turn it over to Dominic, other things that need to be for the good of the cause? Well, with that, then, Dominic, welcome. Penny? Yes, I'm going to give you a phone number. It is my phone number. It's on autopilot, or whatever it is, airplane mode, something. Whatever it is. As those of you who know me, I'm technologically challenged. But I will be checking that. If you have a question, I will then jot these down and we'll present them to Dominic. Got your pencil ready? As they say, got your pencil ready? Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, anytime you want to. And you want. Okay, just before lunch, we'll make an announcement. Phyllis wants to take a picture of the group. Fine. Those of you who are at home can send your picture. Anyway, my phone number, pencil ready, I've given you time, 407-595-3687. And I'll retrieve those messages and give a chance for Dominic to respond to them. As many as possible. There may be more than we can respond to. And if you've got anything nasty to say, save it for another time. No, we don't. Okay, the number again, 407-595-3687. All right, would you all welcome Dominic, our dear friend, for 30 years, putting up with us and vice versa.
Thank you, John. Okay, is my sound all right? Okay. Couple of words of introduction. Maybe you know this already, but starting with my name, that's John Dominic Crossan. Why can't I be normal and say John D. Crossan like ordinary people? It sounds so pretentious to me. The reason is fairly important. In 1950, I was 16 years of age, and having nothing else to do, I decided to join a monastery. When you go into a monastery, they wipe out your past, your old name, like in the Bible, when you get a new vocation, and they give you a new name. So wipe out the past, give you a future. So I was John Crossan, went into the monastery, and I immediately became Brother Dominic, and eventually Father Dominic. So 19 years later, suddenly realized that celibacy was vastly overrated, decided to leave the monastery and get married, but with that one exception, I was taking everything else with me. So I stuck Dominic in the middle. It has no legal standing whatsoever. My government knows me as John, passports, TSA, remember TSA? TSA, driving license, John. Government knows me as John, God knows me as Dom, and they, for the last 4 years, have not been on speaking terms, so there's no confusion whatsoever. Anyone who knows me as Dominic or Dom. That's the way I think of myself, all right? Second piece of autobiography, if you'll indulge me. Exactly 20 years ago today, at 10 o'clock, I was at Everett University in Danville, Virginia, which is just across the North Carolina border. I was giving a lecture on Jesus and violence. 10 o'clock on the morning of 9/21. Most of the students coming to a lecture at 10 had got up maybe at 9:55 probably, and had no idea what was going on. We got a glimpse of it as we were robing. So 20 years ago today, Jesus and violence. I leave it to yourselves to decide whether we are better after 20 years. But in my own case, I sat in that motel room until Thursday, couldn't take it anymore, waiting for flights that would never be allowed. Kept telling you every day. I finally rented a car, and drove 12 hours straight down 95 to get home to Sarah. So that's my autobiography for 9/11. Now, what we're going to do here, 2 lectures. One is explicitly, totally from the Old Testament. The second from the New Testament. I'm making this distinction just for the moment. In each case, I'm going to begin with images. Images. I'll talk through them. They'll be showing up there, of course, and I'll be talking about them. And then I come back here and talk some more before our questions and answer. Please take the images seriously. Don't think they're just kind of visual aids. This is a visual aid. These are the thing itself. I want to show you these images because the first thing I want to discuss is to think about the Old Testament as if the New Testament never existed. Just for this morning, we're going to look at the Old Testament. And I want to ask, is there in the Old Testament itself, we're not talking about Jesus, is there glimpses in the Old Testament, stronger than glimpses in the Old Testament, that somehow or other, this violent God, there's something wrong? Is it there in the Old Testament itself, or if you prefer the Hebrew Bible? So I'm going to go back now and start the images, but take a look at these when we're going. The hard cover to the left, the soft cover to the right, and of course, the key word in there was still. When I said to my editors to propose the book to Harper One in San Francisco, they went with the book on the title alone. They went with the book on the word still alone. Because obviously you read the Bible to be a Christian. So how could you read the Bible and somehow have to wrestle to be a Christian? All right. Hang on. Okay, you hear me. You see the key question up there is the violence of God. And of course, you cannot answer it by the cliche the libel we always get that, well, the Old Testament is a God of vengeance and violence, but the New Testament is a God of mercy and love, which really sounds good unless you make the mistake of reading the Bible. in which case, as you all know too well, the most violent book in the entire Bible. I taught world religions for 26 years at DePaul. The most violent book in the canonical literature of all the world's religions is the book of Revelation. So you can't get away with that by saying bad God, Old Testament, good God, New Testament. So this morning, the first lecture, I'm going to compare Sanction Theology and Sabbath Theology. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. You're not supposed to, because I invented those terms, more or less. But we'll get to it in a minute. The first question I want to ask, when the first time the Bible describes violence, which by coincidence is the first time you ever get the word sin, what does God seem to think about human violence? Chapter 4 of Genesis is like a desperate attempt by God to stop the growth of human violence. Before we even get to projecting our violence onto God and having God presumably do what we would do, I want to look at the story in Genesis chapter 4, the parable of human evolution since the Neolithic or the agricultural age. We're talking about 10,000 years ago about. The story you can see on that beautiful piece of ivory up above. It's from Salerno. There's a whole set of Old Testament and New Testament scenes. You can see Cain to left, taking his gift to God, Abel to right, one taking the grain, the other taking the sheep. And God, as you see the hand coming down, prefers Abel. Now that's simply because the Old Testament God is countercultural and says everyone prefers the older son to the younger son. God goes for the younger son. I don't see any evidence he prefers sheep to grain. Then, of course, you see in the next what happens is Cain kills Abel. Also notice that what God does is not exact vengeance. No vengeance is exacted on Cain for the murder. He is marked for non-violence. The scene, on one hand, is a kind of a contradiction because you're supposed to be imagining only 4 people in the world, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. But obviously there's tribal enclaves behind them. So Cain is the farmer. And the background of this is the Sumerian story of the twin brother gods, the farmer god, and the herder god. In the Sumerian story, they managed to reconcile and live together. The biblical story is more historically accurate, I think. The farmer Cain, the herder Abel, and you know all too well what happens. The farmer kills the herder. And by the way, I'd like to thank my beloved Sarah for the marvelous cutouts that you can see on these from the originals. So the farmer kills the herder and builds the first city. Kind of read Genesis 4 and he builds the first city. It's built by Cain. And of course, as we know in the long drag of history, the city will eventually kill the farmer. All right, now here's the point. Imagine God trying to say, how do I stop this? First of all, Cain, after he killed, when he's thinking about killing Abel, God says to him, this is Genesis 4, God says to him, sin, first time sin is ever mentioned in the Bible. God says sin is crouching at the door. He's imagining him like in the desert in a tent, and sin is like a feral animal crouching at the door, waiting to get you when you come out. But there's nothing about that you can't handle it. He is told, God telling Cain, you should be able to overcome sin. Don't do it. Don't kill Abel. It's up to you. Then, of course, as you know exactly what happens. Cain kills Abel. And again, you wait for the vengeance of this punishing God. Shouldn't he avenge it? And instead, Cain is marked with a sign so that nobody should take revengeance on him. Again, you have to be imagining their tribes, because the scene here is the escalatory violence of blood vengeance in the desert tribes. That's what they're imagining. They can't imagine the beginning of warfare yet. This is blood vengeance among the desert tribes. You kill one of ours, we'll kill two of yours. You kill four of ours, you kill eight of... Escalatory violence. So what I'm emphasizing here is God's attempt to stop what I'm hyphenating as escalatory violence. So violence escalates exponentially. You have Cain, first of all, killing one, and then you have Lamech. Lamech is about 5 generations later, towards the end of Genesis chapter 4. And Lamech, you can see him on the right there, he's boasting to his wives, and here's what he says. I have killed a young man for striking me. You strike me, I kill you. That's escalation. And then he mocks, as it were. If Cain's death is avenged sevenfold, you touch Lamech and you'll get 77-fold. Genesis 4 is the parable of the growth of escalatory violence, or the creation, you might say, of escalatory violence. Just to remind you, for example, of what that actually means, here's the rather famous image of the battle standard of Ur. Ur is this, you may remember in the Bible, is a city in southern Mesopotamia from which Abraham comes. We're dating it this about 4,600 years ago. If you can see, at least on the bottom register of that banner, look at the chariots. They've already got chariots, 4-wheel chariots, led by wild mules, onagers. And notice they're trampling on people. Can you see the bodies underneath the horses? This is a whole triumph from top to bottom. The king is in the middle of the top of victory, warfare victory. So I'm talking about escalatory violence, and I'm using this almost like it's hyphenated. Escalatory violence. It took us only 3,000 years to get from iron swords, 3,000 years to get from iron swords to atomic bombs. We are really good at this. And it could be, you might say that, well, we improve everything, I suppose, and maybe we've just improved violence. But the worst day of the Roman legions in the first century never really threatened even the ecosphere of the Mediterranean, because if you try a nice steel sword, say a Spanish steel sword, on an olive tree, the olive tree will win, hands down. We, however, can destroy our world. That's one of our finest inventions. So the thesis is that only nonviolent revolution. Now, I want to be very careful here. I'm never, ever talking about nonviolence. The Romans were all in favor of nonviolence. They would have given Jesus a medal for nonviolence. It's nonviolent rebellion, nonviolent resistance, and programmatically that becomes a nonviolent revolution against violence. So the thesis is that only nonviolent revolution can stop escalatory violence while there is still time, because we are always escalating, and we have never used what we did not invent. Let me put this in the wider framework, taking it from history back into evolution. If you think of evolution as the sea, then history is like the waves of the sea. So don't mistake the waves for the sea. About 13, well, he says 0.5, somebody says 0.8, but who's counting? 13.8 billion years ago, matter, energy, time, and space came into being as the Big Bang. I'm asking us, I think, when Paul said, get to know God through creation and Christ, to maybe cross out the word creation and put in the word evolution as the mode of creation? And here's my question. This is the bigger question behind the book. Should nonviolent resistance, I almost like to take that as one word, nonviolent resistance, could it change and transform humanity's evolutionary future? Not just kind of ethical or even religious future, but evolutionary future. Please think about it this way. Think of evolution as like the business face of God. We all kind of have a sort of a professional business face, and then we also have a personal face. I think of evolution as the business or professional face of God. And then for Christians, Jesus is the personal face of God. Jesus for Christians is what God looks like in sandals. With a mask, maybe. Okay, give me 1 second to close down here, and I'll go back up there. So the first point is that when violence first appears in the Bible, and when concomitantly the word sin first appears in the Bible, you get escalatory violence, and God is trying to do everything God can to stop it. And failing dismally, clearly, as the story goes on. An interesting footnote. In Jewish tradition, you can see that people are worried about the fact that Cain doesn't get it. Because clearly he should be punished, because we know that's what it's all about. So there is a legend, I guess you would call it, that later on, one of the descendants of Lamech, which you saw up there, becomes blind. But he's a hunter. Remember, he has a bow and arrows in his hand. Lamech is a hunter. So his son, Jubal-Cain, by coincidence, takes him hunting and tells him how to shoot, where to shoot. They hear a rustling in the thickets, and they shoot. Guess who it was? Cain. So finally, Cain is killed without being killed, accidentally, sort of, but yeah, it seems right. So let's face it, we like punishment. We really like punishment. So what I want to look at, I'm going to look at some texts. And I want to ask a very simple question now, our second point. Granted Genesis 4, is there any evidence in the Old Testament itself? I'm not talking about Jesus yet, because I know the Christian solution to the Bible should be that Jesus is the solution to the Bible. That's the Christian answer. We ask, what would Jesus do? We don't ask, what does the Bible say? You see Jesus again and again holding the book. You never see him reading it. He may be doing this. He may have it like that to us, and it may well say, I am the truth and the life, or something like that. But you never see Jesus reading it. He is the norm of the book. We are Christians. We're not Bible-ians. And with all due respect to Islam, when it says we're the people of the book, no, we're not. We're the people with the book. We're the people of the person. What would Jesus do? That's what makes us Christians. Nothing better than anyone else. It doesn't make any criticism anywhere. That's who we are. All right. But now I'm asking a slightly different question in this first lecture. If you didn't have Jesus, if you didn't have any of that, is there any glimpses in the Old Testament that they're kind of very nervous about this punishing, violent God themselves? That's what I want to look at. We've seen one, which is what happens when God refuses to punish Cain for the first murder, but tries to stop it by putting a mark on him so nobody will touch him. Okay? Here's the second one. We're looking at Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pentateuch, because as you well know, Penta is 5, and like the Pentagon or pentathlon in Olympics. The first 5 books. Now, I'm looking at the first chapter of the first book and the last chapter, more or less, of the last book, Deuteronomy. So the first chapter of Genesis and the last chapter, almost the last chapter of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28. Chapter you should all read and then weep quietly over it. Because it lays out quite clearly, and without any backing off, here's the way it works. If you obey the Lord your God, all things will happen well with you. Now, we're not talking about heaven. Heaven hasn't been invented yet. We're talking about here below on the earth. If you obey the Lord your God, you'll have fertility of the womb, fertility of the animals, fertility of the land. Your enemies will flee 7 ways before you. All very empirical, check-upable stuff. And you get 16 verses of all the good stuff. If you obey the Lord your God, all this good stuff will work. Then you flip and get 64 verses of the bad stuff, which is like the flip of that. If you disobey the Lord your God, you will have infertility of the womb, infertility of the draft animals, infertility of the land, and you will flee 7 ways before your enemies. Now, when you read that chapter, and do read it, you're looking at the genesis of the whole idea throughout the entire Bible. It's called Deuteronomic Theology, or as I called it, Sanction Theology. A world run by rewards and punishments. Now, if you think, well, this is weird biblical stuff, and if you're not into the Bible, you wouldn't hear it. Every time you hear somebody saying, what did I do to deserve this? You're thinking Deuteronomically if you never heard of it. And if you want to know in a horrible situation after a hurricane or a disaster, what did I do or why me? That's what you're asking. The good old Deuteronomic question. And I even get nervous when I hear somebody announcing I'm truly blessed because my house wasn't touched. Then is it truly cursed that your neighbor was devastated? I don't know. This is, bar none that I know of, the most successful bad theology in the history of the world. It must plug into something deep in our psyche and our childhood. That we kind of feel more at home with a punishing, rewarding God, of course, both. But I remind you, in good old Deuteronomy 28, what you got was 16 verses of the goodies and 64 verses of the baddies. Now, that's there, and it's going to go through the entire Bible. It really is, and I can take you through it. That's the way they're going to judge everything. Where are there glimpses in the Bible that maybe this isn't quite working? I mean, this is terribly empirical. You're not saying if you're good, you'll be rewarded in heaven, so you can't prove it. Think for a second. Just pause. Let's confuse this with facts. Israel is living on the Levantine coast of the Mediterranean. It's a tiny little tribal enclave. The wonder is that it hasn't disappeared along with the Edomites and the Moabites and the Kilobites and all the tribal enclaves going to the gene pool of the Middle East. They're clinging to the Levantine coast. They're the link, the hinge between the 3 then known that they knew Africa, Europe, and Asia. If they want to get at one another, go through Israel. When empire was working northeast between, say, Mesopotamia and Egypt, they're coming right through your backyard. East-west between the Parthians, the Persians, Romans and the Persians and Greeks, Romans and Parthians, they're coming right through. The truth is, if Israel had spent their lives on their knees praying, they would still have been slaughtered. It's absolutely false, what we call misinformation, to say that if they're only good, their enemies will flee 7 ways before them. It's just not true. Now, that's fair enough. We know that. But I'm asking again, do they get a glimpse of this kind of not working? First example. They saw the problem when you had a king like Manasseh, who was by their judgment a bad king, and he ruled for 40 plus years. That's not good Deuteronomic theology. He could have been zapped by about year 2. And then there's Josiah, who is about the best king after David, and he dies in battle. So a bad king lives too long, a good king dies too soon. Where's Deuteronomy? And it's fascinating because the book of Kings will tell you that story, just the way I just told it to you. And then when you read the book of Chronicles, which is like a cleanup operation conducted after the Babylonian exile, when they're getting the Bible sort of set up properly, they have to clean up those 2 stories. You can read it, and you can watch Chronicles following the book of Kings. He's copying like mad, copying plagiarism is called. And then all of a sudden he gets to this point. 4 new verses are inserted that says, the king of Assyria took Manasseh over to Babylon. That's the giveaway. That's the Babylonians. Over to Babylon. He converts, repents, God takes him back, and he's all right. In other words, they clean up the theology by changing history. Does that sound familiar? If your theology isn't working, change history. Just say it didn't happen. And Josiah, what are we going to do with Josiah? You can do the same thing. I'm not mocking this because I understand these people are trying to understand it. You can read Kings here and Chronicles here. They're following, tick, 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 tick. They're using the same archival stuff. Then all of a sudden they get to Josiah killed in battle. How do we explain it? He's killed by Pharaoh Necho from Egypt. And they say in Chronicles, Pharaoh Necho was going under command of God, and he told Josiah, don't try to stop me because I'm operating under the command of God. That's the big G, the biblical God. Josiah does it. In other words, he disobeys God, and he gets killed. So we've cleaned up the theology by cleaning up the history. First case, they're recognizing the problem. Second case, Job should have finished it off once and forever, because that was his purpose. You know the story. The background is the Persian Empire, when the Persian emperor has somebody who is kind of like a combination between a Secretary of Foreign Affairs and a head of the CIA. He's called the Satan. He's not the devil. He goes around the world for God, checking up on the satrapies of the Persian Empire. Comes back to heaven to report to God, and God starts the whole problem by saying, have you seen Job? Is he not the holiest man on earth? So God's honor is immediately committed that Job is the holiest man on earth. And Satan says, having read Deuteronomy, of course, he's in it for the goodies. He knows Deuteronomy. that if you obey the Lord your God, you'll get blah, 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 which puts God in a kind of a bind. Who's running this world? Him or Deuteronomy, as it were. Excuse me. So God says, okay, we run a test. And by the way, poor Job was never let in on this. We just run a test. I'm going to take everything from Job. Everything. His health, his wealth, everything he's got. And we'll see who's right. We'll see whether he is good. So they're running a test case on Job. All right, Job is stripped of everything, and he has 4 friends, and they are friends. They're absolutely sincere. They are Deuteronomic fundamentalists. They're absolutely sincere. They're trying to understand what did Job do to bring such a terrible punishment on him? Because clearly, this is the worst thing they could imagine. So he must have done something awful. And they tell Job, would you just repent for whatever awful thing you did? God will forgive you, and you'll be back where you were. We can all go home and have a drink. And they say it again and again and again and again. And Job says again and again, I don't know what I did. I mean, he's not insincere enough to say, well, whatever I did, I'm sorry for it. Job is honest. They're honest. But all Job can say is, I don't know what I did. He doesn't say, I'm the holiest man on earth. That's God's business. He simply says, I don't know what I did. Now, it's gorgeous Hebrew poetry. Chapter after chapter after chapter. And we, the reader, know it's all baloney. We do. Because we've been let into heaven in chapter 1 and 2 and know what's going on. Job doesn't. They don't. But we know the Deuteronomic theology just doesn't work. And at the end, of course, not that we need it, God says, you guys are all wrong, and Job gets all his stuff back. But Job has never told the truth, by the way. The one thing God doesn't tell Job, despite all the kind of the bluster who he is, this was just an experiment. Please don't take it personally. You know, I give you back your camels. What's the problem? Now, that should have ended the Deuteronomy. You should have been laughed out of court. Because that's what it was intended to do. Instead, I would say Job became a speed bump on the Deuteronomic superhighway. Right on. Right on. Straight into the New Testament, where somebody can say to Jesus, looking at a blind man, who sinned? This, obviously he couldn't, he was born blind. His parents must have sinned. Somebody must be being punished. They saw the problem. Did they have any solution? Now I want to turn from the last chapter, it's almost the last chapter, of the Torah, Deuteronomy, to the first chapter, Genesis 1, the first chapter. Also, before I begin, this is not simply an argument that the earlier one must be better than the later one. After the Babylonian exile, in the Restoration, when they're putting together their Bible, organizing their traditions, trying desperately to hold together a people where their temple has been destroyed. By the way, to understand the Persians invented the first Marshall Plan. They had a new idea of empire. Instead of the Babylonians or the Assyrians hitting you every springtime and looting you for what you're worth, why couldn't we put everyone back on their feet and tax them? It's a brilliant idea. It's the Marshall Plan. It's much better than leaving them prostrate and then we'll go on whatever they got. We loot them every springtime. Old-fashioned empire. This was new-fashioned empire. So, of course, the Jews are sent home under Persian controls, Persian finances. Put your people back together, build your temple, get your law back. And they're organizing the Bible. Now, the first chapter is not the first chapter of the Bible. It's the prologue, the preface, the overture. It's that text through which they want you to read every other text that follows. It really wipes out Deuteronomy once and for all. That's what's going on in that creation in 7 days. And we got all uptight about it and say, well, is it really 7 days? It's pure poetry. And by poetry, I do not mean that I'm thinking it's poetry, but they really took it literally. The person who wrote Genesis 1, and it's a he because it's from the priestly tradition, it's a he, knew exactly what he was doing. And the reason he knew exactly what he was doing is if, again, you read it carefully, you can see it. You can see the cracks in the narrative. And it's the cracks in the narrative that give away the purpose of the writing. For example, when you read Genesis 1, and if you want to be technical, it goes from 1:1 to 2:4a, but Genesis 1 for short. When you read it, the first thing you notice is the same expressions keep coming up. And God said, let there be, and there was, and God blessed, and there was morning and evening one day. When you're learning Hebrew, it's your dream chapter. You get a couple of words and phrases in, and you got the whole thing down. And you think this is going to be easy, and then you hit chapter 3. And it's not so easy. But the repetition of the same words over and over again is one of the standard refrains that tells you poetry. When you get a refrain that keeps coming up, watch for poetry. So that's one thing. Second thing, when you're reading carefully, you notice that there's 8 chunks of stuff. There's 8 times when it reads, and God said. 8. And they're pretty obvious. It's like if somebody went out in the ancient world or the modern and looked around the world, well, at least the ancient world, and saw all this stuff. You have to get the heavens, you have to get the earth, you have to get the seas, you have to get the plants, and you have to get the animals. You know, they have to get everything invented. And they find there's 8 chunks of stuff. And here's the second time they begin to see the problem. Because you can't have a 9-day week. Somehow or other, 8 chunks of stuff have to be squeezed, shoehorned into 6 days. Now, these are the clues that tell you what the author is up to. Why doesn't he just have 8? And you can see it because on day 1, and God said. Day 2, and God said. Day 3, and God said, and God said. Day 4, and God said. Day 5, and God said. Day 6, and God said, and God said. So you double up on the third day and the 6th day, and you get your 8 chunks of stuff into 6 days. Why is that so important? Or again, you look at the first day, and you think these people are silly. The first day, God invents day and night. But it's not till the 4th day he gets the sun and the moon. How stupid. No. Because you can't, if you don't get day and night on the first day, you can't get a week. And everything's going to end with a refrain, and there was evening and morning one day. The week is terribly important. And then you finally get it. You finally get it. We're getting the meaning of creation, not the details. You finally get it. We are not the crown of creation. We're the work of a late Friday afternoon. The crown of creation is the Sabbath. Yeah, but yeah. So this is an advertisement for you're supposed to go to the synagogue or the church, or you're supposed to go to worship. So let me stop and go in for texts, Because when all else fails, read the text. What is the Sabbath about? I'm not talking about our Sabbath or our Sunday. We thought, well, they had the Saturday, we'll have a Sunday. We'll show them. Here's what the Sabbath is about. The purpose of it. You ready? Exodus. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Duh, we all knew that. So that is always what the Bible says when it's giving you the meaning of something. So that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. There's nothing here about going to the temple, going to the, few hours off on Saturday so you can go to the synagogue or the church. It's about your ox and your donkey and your slave and the resident alien. That's Exodus. Deuteronomy. The 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. That's what we all know. Don't stop then. Don't stop there. You or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or your chickens, now I put that in, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Now, by the way, notice this is addressed to the householders of Israel, to the wives and husbands. It's not addressed to the husband, and the wife is one part. It's addressed to the wives and husbands. What it's saying simply is this: everyone, even your draft animals, your slaves, deserves a rest. Now maybe we say, oh, come on, we all know that. That's the weekend. Yeah. But before you ever get to everyone having enough food, having enough health, having enough education, there had to be enough rest for everyone. And maybe we shouldn't take it for granted that everyone gets it. So the Sabbath is not about getting a little time off to worship God. It is worship of God. It's the fair distribution of rest. In fact, we're talking distribution. God is the God of distribution because in this chapter of Genesis, the first thing God does in creating us, female and male alike, is to distribute God's own self to us. The first distribution is we are made in the image and likeness of God. That's distribution. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we're put in charge of the world. You can see that. But it's a world run by the Sabbath. This is what I mean by talking about Sanction Theology in Deuteronomy and Sabbath Theology. Now, I'm using Sabbath in the sense it has in the Bible. The fair distribution, in this case, we're talking about rest, the rock bottom basic of life, before you even get to food and shelter and everything else. Rest. And in case you think, well, that's pushing it a bit on the Sabbath day, it's continued into the Sabbath year. So the Sabbath runs through the Bible, to use John's trains. There's the train of the sanction. And you can go right through the Bible and you can really say case after case, somebody is punished, somebody is rewarded. It's all there. But so is the Sabbath. It's like another train. And the Sabbath is, how do I put this? The Sabbath is the basis of creation because just distribution is the basis of creation. That's the claim of Genesis 1. Let me be careful. We tend to use the word justice in ordinary speech to mean retributive justice, punishment. That's when we talk about the Department of Justice is not into distribution. It's basically into punishment, or sanctions at least. The Uniform Code of Military Justice. In ordinary speech, we use justice as a shorthand for punishment or retributive justice. I want you to think, really think. You couldn't have retributive justice even if it wasn't distributed fairly. In the Bible, in speech, forget the Bible, whenever justice is used without any qualification, it means distributive justice. Distribution of whatever we're talking about. If you're talking about justice and, say, vaccinations or something, how is it distributed fairly? What would we consider to be an unfair distribution? So justice, when people in the Bible cry out, give us justice, they're not saying, please punish us. They're saying, give us a fair distribution of the world. And of course, what the Bible is claiming is the world belongs to God. And it should be distributed fairly because that's built into the constitution of the world. That's what Genesis is about. The metronome of justice beats on the Sabbath, and it's built into time itself. Go back and think of that thing with the Big Bang, time and place. They built it sort of into the world itself because they're weak. They didn't have calendars, and how did they know a week? Well, they knew it by the Sabbath. But the Sabbath is about justice. So justice is built into the very fabric of the Bible by Genesis 1. And you'll notice, by the way, that nobody says in Genesis 1, yeah, but supposing we don't do it. Well, now, start thinking. If we are made in the image and likeness of God, and you don't act accordingly, what will happen? If you are not a bird and go up to a 30-story building and think you're a bird, what will happen? You will not be punished by the pavement hitting you. That will be a consequence. So let's pause a minute now and get the language. Punishment, consequence. I'm using these as terribly specific terms, not the way parents use them with children. When they use consequence would mean punishment. Sounds nicer. Punishment comes externally from an action. Consequence comes internally from an action. A drunk driver crashes the car into a tree and is killed. That is a consequence. A drunk driver crashes a car into a tree and is fined by the police. That's a punishment. One's internal, one's external. Sanction theology is punishment. It comes externally. If you do this, you'll be punished or you'll be rewarded. Sabbath theology is internal. This is who you are. Go right ahead and try and do anything you want. It's almost as if you got into your car and the message came on, do feel quite free to run out of gas, run out of oil, run the car with your brake on. You're quite free to do it, but there will be consequences. Maybe we need that distinction to be sounded again with regard to vaccinations, by the way. Consequences come internally, punishments come externally. So, let me go back. The Sabbath year. Now, you're thinking in Sabbath theology, you've been made in the image and likeness of God. God's own distribution to you is God's image and likeness. That's who you are. The Sabbath year. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Now we usually stop there and everyone says, oh, that's good agricultural practice. You should let your land be fallow so the nutrients can be. We're great on this. Ooh, we're really good on agricultural procedures. But the Bible says so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the wild animals may eat. Huh? Do the same with your vineyard and your olive orchard. Every Sabbath year, you have to let them all go fallow so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the wild animals may eat. Now, by the way, one of the fascinating things about reading the Bible, when people start trying to read through the Bible, Genesis is great, marvelous stories. You can imagine them all as a TV series. Exodus is pretty good for a while. Then all of a sudden you run into law. This law, that law, and your eyes start to glaze over. If you could put all these laws in chronological sequence, what you'd have to admire is how marvelously these people spend their lives trying to beat the law. And how the poor law is running along, always scurrying to catch up, and never quite catching up. But you can read the logic of the law is to try desperately to maintain an inaugural vision of justice. That's the logic of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't need all this stuff. We're awfully good. And we're not dealing with evil people. We're just dealing with people like us, smart people. The function of law is to avoid justice. Paul would have understood that, by the way. That's why he spends so much time criticizing law. Not because it's wrong, because it's what it can do. Anyway, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Sabbath. It's almost like the land is something physical. It deserves a rest. 6 years, you need a Sabbath of complete rest for the land. A year of complete rest for the land. It's fascinating. You may eat what the land yields during its Sabbath rest. You, your male and female slaves, your hired and bound laborers who live with you, your livestock and the wild animals. You can eat whatever is there, but you can't sow. Now, nobody knows if this is really followed. We really don't. Maybe it's something like, the preamble to our Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Nothing to do with reality whatsoever. Just a beautiful vision. Well, if it isn't, then maybe we've got it all wrong. If this is something you kind of skip, it's nice. It's really nice. It's like everyone created equal. It's a lovely idea, but we don't have to follow it. Then maybe we got it wrong. The 10 Commandments are just suggestions. They're not really serious. Any 6 or 7. But, it's like multiple choice. The Sabbath year, so the first thing on the Sabbath year is rest for the land. That's the first thing. Second thing, remission of debts. Every 7th year, you shall grant a remission of debts. Then it goes on to do exactly what we know. Then people won't give you any loans because they'll see it coming. Yeah. God says, be careful, I'm watching. Remission of debts. A third thing. Every Sabbath year, slaves must be freed. Now, what you're talking about here is not a slave economy. You're talking about primarily people who are trapped into debt and sold into slavery to protect the family farm, as it were. That's what you're really talking. And you're trying desperately to contain the growth of inequality. That's the logic of all of this stuff. There's a sentence in Isaiah. He says, woe to you who add house to house and land to land until you live alone in the midst of the land. They knew exactly what's going on. The thrust of civilization is how do I keep mine and get yours? And the thrust of these laws are like a desperate containing program to mitigate as best you can and contain the growth of inequality. Otherwise, there's no reason you have to keep going with this thing. Just say it once. Sabbath year. Finally, you know it, the Sabbath Jubilee. Every 50 years, every 7 sevens, notice the sevens keep coming up. 7 days, 7th year, 7 sevens, 50th year. Count off 7 weeks of years. This is Leviticus. That's the book we all read regularly, right? 7 times 7, and then so-and-so's. Then everyone goes back to their original ownership. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property and every one of you to your family. Here's what they're imagining. God has distributed the land fairly to all the tribes and families. That's the ideal. Now, busybodies, of course, are working very hard to get your land, keep mine, get yours, of course. Every 50 years, go back to zero base. And once again, we scholars rush in to put out the fires because that's our job. And we say, well, we don't know they really did that. Well, maybe they did it once after the exile, but we really don't know every 50 years they did it. Well, if they didn't do it, what it means is they're disobeying the heart of the Torah. And I'm back again with my suggestion that maybe the 10 Commandments are simply like red lights in Orlando. You know, if you happen to like to follow them, by all means, but it's kind of a choice, not a decision. So what am I saying? The logic of the law. The logic of the law is this. Creation created a just world. There's no sanctions really in there. It doesn't keep mentioning, and if you don't do this, you'll be punished, and if you don't do this, you'll be... It simply says, this is who you are. As if to say, well, isn't that obvious? If this is who you are, then if you don't do it, you will destroy yourself. It's as obvious as I said this when you get into your car, do feel free to drive any way you want, but there's ways that'll work and ways that won't work. And don't blame whoever made your car as a punishment if you don't do it and run it out of oil or something in days when you used to be able to do that. So Genesis 1 is put up there as the first, what would I put it? The optics through which they want you to see the whole Bible, including all this punishing stuff that you're going to get at the end of the Torah. They didn't take that out. They didn't. They couldn't probably. But things like, for example, you can't buy, again, I'm back at Leviticus. The statement by God, you cannot buy and sell land because the land belongs to me. There goes the neighborhood. Then how do I get yours? You cannot buy and sell land because the land belongs to me. It's off the market. Now, land was capital for them. Land was it. If it was capitalism in the ancient world, it was landism. So if land is off the market, now watch what people did. Land is off the market. Land, I can't buy and sell land. Loans and foreclosures. Got it. Loans and foreclosures. I'll give you a loan. Okay, at the end of the season, you're in trouble. You don't have enough seed barley for the next year. I will give you a loan. Free. I jumped ahead, sorry. I'll give you a loan. If you default on the loan, I take your land. I'm not buying it, I'm foreclosing. So you can see the law scurrying along trying to catch up and saying, no, you can't take interest. Well, foreclosure really isn't interest. I'll give it to you free for 6 months. But I get it. The struggle in the law, the logic of how the law keeps continuing, is because the people who are honestly giving the law, as I said, as we honestly gave the Declaration of Independence, even though we were not going to follow it, but we put it down there, and then we have to work at how to get around it. If all of this in the Bible was simply untouched, beautiful, I would think it's like Disney World. What I love about the Bible is I see real people trying to beat it. If there weren't real people trying to beat it, then it's not realistic. It's just not realistic. It's like the Declaration of Independence, the Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. Nobody gets worried about that. You say it every day. Nobody thinks that children shouldn't be indoctrinated in justice. We kind of know we're not going to take it seriously. So I'm talking now again just within the Old Testament. What I love about the Old Testament, and I mean it, without which I wouldn't understand the New Testament, is at least they're struggling, because somebody has to be doing this stuff. And you can see it must be real. You have the story of Nabath's vineyard, where the king says to Naboth, I'd like to buy your vineyard, give you a very good price for it, because it's close to my palace and I'd like to use it. That's a perfectly fair question. And Naboth says, I can't do it. It's against the law. And Ahab's queen, who's a Canaanite princess, who comes from a different economic theology. It's called free trade. Can't even see what's going on. This is disrespect to the king. How do you mean you can't sell your land? So she takes it and has him executed. So it makes no sense. So you can watch people then trying to get around this and saying, okay, can't buy and sell land. But there's always foreclosures, and you can't take interest. Okay, foreclosure will take care of that. The logic is the Bible itself is trying to maintain a just world, at least among themselves, and is quite aware that sanctions really don't cut it. That there's a different vision in Genesis 1. It's who we are. That's why I would ask you to think of the biblical God and to think of human evolution. And my own point is where those two vectors cross one another, because evolution is absolutely fair. I don't like the way it's fair. I don't think it should be fair to viruses. And a few other things I could list too, but I won't. But evolution is absolutely fair. It sounds awfully like the biblical God. In fact, if you were to go to the entire, let's say the Old Testament, stick with that. Don't take this literally. Take it just as an exercise. And cross out God and put in evolution. It would make tremendous sense. So, let me open it for questions. I managed to drop all my name tags on the floor. Nice notice. That's what happens if you open your case upside down. So when we're ready, we can go to questions. Yeah, pretty good time. Let me get these.
Yes, hold the mic closed, and there you are.
Maybe we've solved everything, did we? All right.
Full disclosure, I am a Jewish woman.
All right.
And I have never heard an interpretation about the Bible, the Old Testament, as you gave, and I've often asked about the violence in the Bible, and you certainly helped a lot. But I'm curious why you did not mention in Leviticus, do unto others, as part of the justice, retribution. And I know that I don't want to take up all your time, but what would have happened to Job in the New Testament?
Okay. Let me go back to the first one. I didn't mention it because that wasn't what I was talking about, but it's very important to mention Leviticus 19 says, actually, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you keep going by another 5 or 6 verses, love the resident alien as yourself. That's in Leviticus 19. So even the resident alien is specifically picked up. Refugees, if you will, whatever. So yeah, that's in Leviticus. There's stuff in Leviticus we don't like, sure. But there's an awful lot. And I think if you ask yourself, why are there no sanctions in Genesis 1? Why doesn't God not say, and if you don't do this, you'll be punished? Because it's a different vision. Those two visions are there. And they're in the Hebrew Bible, if you want to use that term, or they're in the Christian Old Testament, that term. They're there. Now, Job in the New Testament, Job was buried as fast as possible, as far as I can see. Buried, forgotten, dismissed. Because Job, that play, A Mask of Reason, written in 1946, M-A-S-Q-U-E, not this type of mask, a play of reason. God finally talks to Job and says, I have to apologize to you, Job, but I suppose you have figured it all out by now. The purpose was, and here's this fabulous phrase, the purpose of Job was to stultify the Deuteronomist. To stultify the Deuteronomist. Stultus is a Latin word for stupid, sorry. To show this just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know in the New Testament if there's any use of Job at all. I don't even know if it might be mentioned somewhere, but I don't even remember. How does justice work in the New Testament? I would think I would like to wait for the second lecture. Because, no, seriously, that is the subject. What I'm doing here is just taking one little thing from the Old Testament, one thing from the New Testament. And in that book, by the way, that was up there, I deliberately ignored Old Testament, New Testament. I said, read the Christian Bible straight through, as if it was presented to you and nobody told you part 1, part 2, because it can be read like that. So I would want to talk about what Jesus says in the New Testament, definitely. So let me hold that for the second lecture, if you would, please. By the way, I think Judaism was very right not to give up the Old Testament because we Christians took it. I think he should have done the same for Jesus. You go ahead and do whatever you want with Jesus, you people. You know what you're doing to the Hebrew Bible. You're changing this, you're changing that, you're doing all sorts of changes. You have your Jesus, your Greek Jesus. We're keeping a Hebrew Jesus. It's not my job to tell Judaism what would be good for it. I think that would have been better for us. We wouldn't have been able to make Jesus quite so easily into what we wanted. But that's just me. All right, anyone else?
I have a little bit of trouble thinking of equating evolution with God, because my idea of evolution is that evolution is in a way is cruel. We talk about the survival of the fittest, or there's no compassion in evolution. Whoever is the stronger will win. We talk about the selfish gene, and so I have a hard time equating God, because like I don't see, like, for example, compassion in evolution. It's just, it is what it is. So how, or maybe we have a different understanding of evolution, or how?
Yeah, I would be very careful. I am not saying to equate evolution and God, and that's not slipping in God at the back of evolution. That's a separate issue. But evolution is absolutely, I'm not going to say the word absolutely fair and just. That was my expression. Fair and just. Everyone has the same chance. Now, it's hard for us to think it's just that a hurricane or a tornado or some natural disaster, as we call it, should kill people. We have been given intelligence. It hasn't. If we want to build in floodplains or in shorelines with our intelligence, that's our problem. If we want to spend our money on, say, a carrier task force, rather than strengthening our defenses against a hurricane, that's our problem. The one thing we have is we're not operating by instinct. We're operating by, I'm going to say we're operating by intelligence. Let me back up into Genesis. The one thing Adam and Eve had coming out of the garden was knowledge of good and evil. I keep reading people who say they came out with knowledge. No, knowledge of good and evil is conscience. That's the only thing they've going for them. Everything else works by instinct, or whatever term you want. We have conscience, the knowledge of good and evil. That's what gives us dominion, if you will. Now, part of that is to learn that you can cooperate with evolution. No, you can't run it. You'll never run it. You're not in charge of evolution. But you should have enough intelligence to cooperate. So, I notice, for example, that the present Pope talks a lot about justice and mercy, or justice and compassion. That means he's thinking of justice as retribution, but it may be mitigated by compassion. That presumes the whole punishing God. If you have punishment, you may have, if you have punishment, you may have forgiveness, and if you don't have forgiveness, you may have mercy. That makes sense in a court. If you have consequence, what you have time to change. That is the great, we can change. Other species can't. And we have time within which we can change. So if you're following the consequence, you're not talking compassion, you're not talking mercy, you're not talking forgiveness, you're talking about the possibility of change and time within which you can change before it's too late. That's built into the universe. So it may not be fair for us to think that other species have rights, if you want to. But that's too bad. That's the way it is. And claiming compassion when we presume punishment, I think it's just bad theology. Let me say again, instead of a theology of punishment mitigated by forgiveness, or at least by mercy, think of consequence mitigated by the fact that you can change. We can actually change. Otherwise, climate change, this is the way we do it, and this is the way we do it. You've always been doing it, so goodbye, we're finished. We are a magnificent, doomed species, like the saber-toothed tiger. So that we can change, and that we have time to change, go along with consequence. So I would like to ask us at least to cross those two, as I said, like vectors. Evolution especially human evolution, and the biblical God, to see where they might cross one another. Anyone else, John? So were people sending in did people send you in messages too? Questions on your phone? Because we have time. Unless, of course, we've solved all the problems of the world.
So these rules, or the Bible, this was the Jewish way of life or code of life, right? And they were within a very tiny community within a much larger context, right? Persians and everybody. Did anybody else think of these rules, follow these rules, or was this all from the Jewish point of view, or just like every culture absorbs ideas from the cultures around it, right? Were these rules what helped them survive?
Okay, let me give you a concrete example. This is especially in Genesis 1 to 11. I've touched on this with the Cain and Abel. Let me take the deluge. When you read the story of the deluge, there's two different stories in there, Genesis 6 to 9. There's too much violence on the earth, so God is going to become the super violence and destroy the earth. Except for the fishes, I guess. I guess they don't mind probably a deluge. Now, you say, what? This is absurd. God's going to solve violence by super violence? By wiping out the human species and, in fact, everyone else except, as I said, the sharks? This is an example of where they're stuck with an ancient story from Mesopotamia, which we have the traditions from, the deluge. Now, what's important is not just that they're stuck with it and have to, it's part of their tradition. They can't ignore it. How do they adapt it? And for that, you have to go read the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and all in English, thank God. It's all on the internet now. You don't really have to go anywhere. And they make two huge changes as they tell the story. In the Mesopotamian story, there's lots of gods, of course. There's a good God and a bad God, to keep it simple. The bad God can't sleep because of the noise that the human race is making. So he's thoroughly annoyed, and he decides to destroy the human race. The good God decides to save and goes to the equivalent of Noah, Utnapishtim is his name, tells him, and what he tells him is marvelous. He tells him, forget possessions, save life. Forget all your stuff. I mean, it's a fabulous statement. We should write it on our hearts. Forget possessions, save life. So get the ark and, save. It's our story. Now, they're stuck with this story. The first change they make is that it's not just because God can't sleep and he's annoyed with the noise. It's because he's going to punish violence. That's not very successful. That's not their best work. But after the story in the Bible, and only in the Bible, God says, I shouldn't have done that. Wow, we finally get repentance. Well, God doesn't really say, I shouldn't have done that. God says, I'll never do that again, which is the closest you ever get in the entire Bible to God saying sorry. If you'll never do that again, you probably shouldn't have done it the first time. That's where you get the rainbow and all the rest of it. So what they're trying to do is take their tradition that they're stuck with and clean it up according to their own vision of God. So they're constantly under the influence of what the term I used for that is the matrix. Matrix is simply everything that's going on in their own time and place. That's why, for example, if the Assyrians like to come in and slaughter you, then their God must be a slaughterer. They're picking up the bad habits of the entire environment, kind of cleaning them up a bit. Now, the big change that you can see is when the Persians, remember the Persians who invented the Marshall Plan, this was for Israel like a revelation. The world's getting better. They had the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they invented terror foreign policy. And then we got the Persians, and they sent us home from Babylon. Wow, maybe empires are changing. That's where they began to really talk about the whole world becoming just. Before that, the most they could imagine was themselves running a just kingdom, if you will, or something. So it goes out then to the whole world, because the extraordinary thing about tiny Israel and its Levantine cliff dwelling is that they didn't say, well, everyone gets the time to beat up everyone else. Someday in the future, God will give us our turn, and we'll have a navy like the Phoenicians, and boy, will we take care of the Assyrians or whoever. That's what you'd expect. Instead, they come up with this totally counterintuitive, absurd idea of a just world. World? I mean, where did they get that one from? It's still the dream. They got it, I think, especially from that glimpse of what happened with the Persians. And from their point of view, it was all good. The Persians were sending them home, you know, I told you all of that. So they imagined maybe a just world. And that, thank God, is the time when the Bible is put together. If it had all been put together under the Assyrians or the Babylonians, it would be very nasty stuff. But at least there's more of the other side because it's put together. And that's when I think Genesis 1 is put in as the overture, let me use that term. So to get this straight before you get all the other stuff. But the whole point of that book, and that's why it's so dense, is that each section of the Bible presumes a different matrix. So if you're reading, say, the book of Amos against, say, the Assyrians or Babylonians, he's seeing things different than somebody who's under the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans. The matrix shifts. And so their vision shifts. Yes?
On the idea of the evolution as the business face of God versus the personal face of God. And if the Deuteronomic theology is the most successful theology in the history of the world, and the purpose of religion and evolution is to create the super cooperative fabric of society so there's trust enough to cooperate and build these cultures. How does the personal face support that kind of social cooperation that has historically been supported by sanctions, punishment, control, if you will?
Okay. Well, moving towards then the second lecture, what we're asking, and I'm asking about the historical Jesus, what do we know about this person? I am going to be arguing this afternoon that Jesus, I'm talking historically. Now, when I say talking historically, it doesn't mean another historian can't argue with me, but I'm not making a theological argument. I can tell you what I think the historical Jesus was doing. Then as a Christian, I tell you, and I think he was right. That's the Christian response. The historical Jesus was living a life programmatically for others as well, of nonviolent resistance to Rome. Not to Rome because it was Rome, but Rome was simply the normalcy of civilization, first century Mediterranean version. Rome was interested in Mediterranean globalization. No empire is interested just in grabbing land, unless it's a very dumb empire. It's interested in economics. You grab land for business purposes. So what I want to do is look at Jesus and see from an historical point of view, is it correct that he is living and dying for non-violent resistance to Rome? Now, always it's non-violent resistance. I've worked with other theologians who keep wanting to say nonviolence, and I'm saying Rome did not crucify people for nonviolence. They were all in favor of it. They gave you medals for it, as it were. Nonviolent resistance is what we're talking about. Otherwise, you can't explain why Jesus would get crucified. That's part of this afternoon. So this is a personal example that it can be done. If a person can live for and die from nonviolent resistance, then it can be done. I might not be able to do it. Somebody else might not be able to do it, but you can't say it can't be done. It's like if somebody says, if you do this, this, and this, you'll be able to run a 3-minute mile. Did I get that right? 3-minute mile, yeah. And I said, no, you can't do that. But you do it. Even one person. Then it can be done. So the vision of the personal face of God is this is what God looks like as a person. You could imagine a different religion in which God is imagined as law, or God is imagined as a text, or God is imagined as a giant cottonwood tree in the middle of the forest. God can be imagined in all sorts of symbols, but those symbols carry baggage, and the baggage will change the power of the symbol. So that's what I'm really talking about. The Christian vision is that we, as Christians, see God on the face of Jesus. But that doesn't tell me anything. It has to do with his life and his death. Not just the fact he was a nice guy, told little stories, patted little babies. So that's the afternoon lecture.
Dominic, I found it very interesting that you had a slide at the beginning of your presentation quoting the Israeli Jewish historian Harari,
Yeah.
who we've studied in our new class. Not just the history of humanity, but what his vision is of the future.
The second volume.
The second volume. We've done book reports on both of those books in the new class. And it prompted me to think about, and there is a question here, that Stephen Hawking, who we all know is one of the great physicists of all times and who wrote A Brief History of Time, was asked the question, there are millions of star systems in our Milky Way, and we have never received any intelligent signals from those star systems. We constantly put out our own, trying to find, civilization and other solar systems within our galaxy, or within the solar system. Within the Milky Way. But we've never received anything back. And he was asked why. And the answer was, well, it's possible that those civilizations never got to the point of being able to send out signals because they destroyed themselves. And my question has to do with the end of the world from in the Old Testament? Is it discussed, and what's your opinion if it is?
Okay. Basically, in the Old Testament, for up until, I'm almost going to give you an exact year, the year 165, it was taken for granted that when you died, that was it. You went down to Sheol, which was like a great big condominium complex of graves beneath the earth. It was dark, it was gloomy, it was dusty down there, because if you went into a tomb, that's the way they were. It was over. And the basic message of the Old Testament was, get over it. You have belonged to the people of God. That is enough. What more do you want? They took it for granted, living right next door to Egypt, where the main industry was getting ready for the afterlife, that there was no afterlife. That meant that everything in the glories of the Torah and the prophets and the wisdom was written by a people who were completely convinced that this was a piece of pagan impertinence. Of course you'd like to live forever. Who wouldn't? But you couldn't. Get over it. Now, what happened in 165 is they ran into a persecution, the Maccabean martyrs, and all of a sudden the question was, not, am I going to live forever, but where is the justice of God when you're looking at the battered body of a martyr? That was their problem. It was about God. When a martyr, you can't use Deuteronomy on a martyr. You can't say you're being punished for your sins. You're dying for God. There has to be an afterlife. It comes in very late. Almost, as I say, you can date it 165 years before Jesus, to explain the justice of God. I think the explanation is quite clear already. If you read Genesis 1, the justice of God is that God has given us God's own image and likeness upon us. But that means we have to act accordingly. So I'm sorry it happened, to be blunt with you. But I understand it. But it also has to do with, if you've been told all your life that any day now God is going to make a just world, after the Persians comes Alexander's Greeks. Yeah. And after the Greeks come the Romans. Empires are going that way. Where's God? If you're looking for the end of the world in the sense of the creation of a just world, it doesn't look like it's going in the right direction. And possibly, this is again little this afternoon, part of the problem is as long as we're waiting for God to do it for us, it's not going to happen. It's a collaboration, it's a participation, not an intervention.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by this notion of a Sabbath theology, and looking at Genesis 1, the poetic marker of, and there was morning and there was evening, the first day, and so on and so forth, signaling the passage of days, that's absent on the seventh day, on the Sabbath day. The morning and evening. In that context and that understanding, is it therefore something that, since there is no essentially end to it, that for Sabbath theology it's an idea that should be expanded beyond just one day of the week or 1 year in 7 years? Is this more of a lifelong, everyday sort of theology?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this is the point that you realize that all this day stuff we've been getting is to get to this day, the seventh day. Otherwise, you might think, well, you're getting a message put crudely that God can't skip the Sabbath, even creating the world. God can't start on a Tuesday and zoom through to a Wednesday or whatever. God has to respect the Sabbath. Now, as I said, put more politely, the crown of creation is the Sabbath itself. And then you're right, it's not a day. It's the fabric of the world. It's the nature of the world. Now, that's what they're claiming, actually, that this is built into the fabric of time, because obviously it changes time. They are telling time according to Sabbaths. You know, it's hard to imagine them, because I can't imagine doing it any other way than weeks. But supposing you never had that, and supposing you told time of who the consuls were, or something like in Rome, then your time, to repeat, the metronome of time beats to the rhythm of justice. Time itself. I think one of the questions I was asked, you could probably go into Mesopotamian law and find a huge amount of the elements that you find in Jewish law there already. For example, a new king might come in Mesopotamia, Assyrians, Babylonians, and declare all taxes are annulled. I did it. I decided, the king. No, it's built into the fabric of time for the Jews because it's every 7 years. You can't say, well, we'll skip it this time. So a lot of the laws are definitely taken from Mesopotamia. Not from Egypt, by the way, much more from Mesopotamia. I think Israel got out of Egypt, but it never got out of Mesopotamia, if you know what I mean. A lot of the laws, but then you got that little twist at the end, that God set it up as the fabric of the universe, which changes it. You could find certain laws about the annulment of taxes, even the freeing of slaves, almost verbatim in Mesopotamian law. But they're done by a new king coming in, say, a new dynasty taking over. You could say they're placating people, or they're, booming the economy, either way. But it's still the king can do it, or not do it. This is totally different because it's built into the fabric of the universe, of time itself. Anything else?
We're getting close to time, and I want Debbie Hill to tell us a little bit about process for lunch. And Phyllis, do you want people to stand or what for your picture? Okay, so Phyllis is going to be taking some pictures. Is that all right? And you go ahead and start taking pictures. And Debbie will tell us a little bit about process for lunch.
Lunch is going to be served in box lunches as a precaution with our COVID outbreak. So there will be downstairs. You can go through and, what am I trying to say? Crystal will have everybody a box lunch. We also have some vegetarian lunches for those who are vegetarian.